On June 17th, two governments signed a document that gave them 60 days. On July 8th, one of them declared it over. On July 14th, the other did the same. They were not talking about the same clause. The document is called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. Pakistan brokered it. It was signed on the 17th of June, 2026, and it was never meant to be a peace treaty. It says so itself. It is an interim framework, 14 numbered points, and it comes with a clock. Point 3 gives the two governments a maximum of 60 days to reach a final deal, extendable only by mutual consent. 60 days from the 17th of June runs to the 16th of August. Hold that date, because it changes how you read everything that follows. Both of the governments that signed this agreement declared it dead while its own clock was still running. It is still running now. Now, I have to be careful here, because the easy version of this story is wrong, and I nearly told it that way myself. The war did not stop on the 17th of June and restart 3 weeks later. The ceasefire was never clean. CNN counted the American strikes of the 8th of July as at least the 4th round since the signing, and Iranian attacks on commercial vessels in the Strait were already underway by the 7th. So the question is not why the shooting resumed. The shooting never fully stopped. The question is why two governments that signed the same 14 points in June could not live with them in July, and why, when each of them announced the agreement was finished, they pointed at different paragraphs. I went and read all 14. I expected a document that was vague everywhere, because vague everywhere is the usual way these things get signed. The Islamabad text reads differently. Most of it is unusually specific. Dollar figures, day counts, named institutions, named methods. One point is not. Before we get to that one point, the shape of the whole thing, and one detail about the copy I am working from. The text is archived by the American Presidency Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Two things about that copy that almost nobody mentions: it is filed as a draft, and its opening line, the one that should name the date and the place of agreement, has blank spaces where those words belong. The document that ended a war does not say where it was signed. I do not know why. It may be nothing. An archived working copy. A formality never filled in. I am telling you because you should know what the available text actually looks like before anyone builds an argument on it. And that includes me. Now, the 14 points. Point 1 declares the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, and it names Lebanon specifically. Remember Lebanon. It comes back. Point 2 is mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. Point 4 is the naval blockade. The United States begins removing it immediately on signing and ends it completely within 30 days, with vessel traffic restored in proportion to pre-war numbers. Point 6 commits the United States, with regional partners, to develop a plan of at least $300 billion for reconstruction and economic development inside Iran. Point 7 commits the United States to terminating sanctions, Security Council resolutions, Atomic Energy Agency Board resolutions, and unilateral American sanctions, both primary and secondary, on a schedule to be agreed. Point 8 is the nuclear file. Iran reaffirms it will not acquire or develop nuclear weapons. Stockpiled enriched material gets resolved by a mutually agreed mechanism, with downblending on site under agency supervision named as the minimum method. Point 9 is the one I want you to notice, because it is the most checkable sentence in the entire agreement. Pending the final deal, both sides maintain the status quo. Iran keeps its nuclear program where it is. The United States imposes no new sanctions and deploys no additional forces in the region. That is not a matter of interpretation. Either new sanctions were imposed or they were not. Either forces were added or they were not. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter more than it looks. Point 10 unlocks oil exports through Treasury waivers. Point 11 unlocks frozen assets. Point 12 creates a monitoring mechanism. Point 14 says the final deal gets endorsed by a binding Security Council resolution. And then there is Point 13, which is the hinge nobody talks about. Point 13 says negotiations on the final deal begin only after the implementation of Points 1, 4, 5, 10, and 11 has started, and continues. So the $300 billion, the sanctions relief, the Security Council resolution, the entire second half of this agreement, none of it moves unless 5 specific points are already in motion. Look at which 5. 3 of them are things the United States does alone. Lift the blockade, issue the waivers, release the assets. One of them is bilateral, the ceasefire, and one of them belongs to Iran. Point 5. Here is what Point 5 actually says. I want to go through it slowly because everything turns on 3 expressions. Upon signing, Iran will make arrangements, using its best efforts, for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days only, from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and back. Traffic starts immediately, and considering the need for removing the technical and military obstacles and demining by Iran, will be instated within 30 days. Then the last sentence. Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the Strait of Hormuz in discussions with the other Gulf littoral states, in line with applicable international law and the sovereign rights of the coastal states. 3 expressions. The first is best efforts. In the language of agreements, that is not an obligation to achieve a result. It is an obligation to treat. If the strait stays closed, best efforts is very hard to breach, because what gets measured is how hard somebody tried. The second is no charge for 60 days only. Read that phrase backwards. A commitment that passage is free for 60 days is also a statement that after 60 days it is something else. What it becomes after that, the document leaves open. It says only. The third is future administration and maritime services. Administration is a word about authority. If a waterway is being administered, somebody is administering it. And the sentence hands the question of who does that to a dialogue between Iran and Oman, with the other coastal states consulted. No deadline, no mechanism, no arbitrator. I checked all 14 points against that standard, because the claim I am about to make needs to survive it. Several others defer their resolution. The sanctions schedule, the nuclear mechanism, the reconstruction plan. Every one of them is anchored either to the final deal or to the 60-day clock. Point 5 is the only place in the document where the subject is handed to a conversation with no date attached at all. So what does Point 5 commit Iran to? The European Union's foreign policy chief said that under the Memorandum, Tehran committed to reopening the strait, and that attacks on shipping violate that commitment. That is a direct reading of the first half of the clause. Iran's foreign minister gave an interview to the state newspaper Iran on the 25th of July, and his reading is the opposite. He said that when Article 5 says Iran will make arrangements, it means Iran determines the required route and mechanisms. He said the 1-month window exists for mine clearance. He said services are free for 60 days, after which Iran and Oman discuss the future management of the waterway. And then he said the thing that makes this episode. He rejected the criticism that Article 5 is ambiguous. He calls that paragraph unambiguous. Sit with that for a second. Two governments read the same paragraph. One says it obliges Iran to reopen an international waterway. The other says it grants Iran authority to administer one. And the side giving the second reading calls the wording clear. Now, I want to be careful about one thing. This reading of paragraph 5 belongs to somebody else first. Michael Singh, of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, said the same thing publicly, that the wording hews much closer to what Iran wanted, because it seems to place responsibility for the strait in Iranian hands, rather than reinforcing that it is an international waterway. I reached his conclusion after him. You should know that. Where I do want to add something is this. I think both sides are reading the text honestly. I think the clause supports both readings, and I think that was deliberate. A clause that meant only one thing would have stayed unsigned. Notice what that implies. The ambiguity was not a flaw that slipped past the negotiators. It was the mechanism that made agreement possible. The hardest question on the table, who controls the Strait of Hormuz, got converted into a sentence both sides could sign and pushed into a dialogue with no calendar. Which was fine, right up until somebody had to act on their reading of it. An unresolved question sits there and waits for the first situation that forces somebody to act on their reading of it. That situation arrived before the shooting did. At some point after the strait began reopening, the United States started urging commercial vessels to use a southern route, hugging the coast of Oman. From Washington's reading of point 5, that is unremarkable. Ships in an international waterway take the safer lane. From Tehran's reading, it was a violation of the agreement. Iran's foreign minister said American forces were actively steering vessels away from the corridor Iran had designated, and that under Article 5, adding or changing a shipping lane required consulting Iran first. He called the alternative route a spiteful move. He also said something worth holding on to, that Article 5 puts the responsibility for demining on Iran, which is the argument for why Iran gets to say where the safe lane is. The same act, a safer route, or an unauthorized one. Both readings trace back to the same paragraph. By the 7th of July, Iranian attacks on commercial shipping in the strait were underway. Central Command named 3 vessels, the Al-Rikayat, the Wedian, and the Cyprus Prosperity, and struck more than 80 targets in response, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 Revolutionary Guard small boats inside and near the strait. Another round followed the next day. On the 8th of July, the United States declared the memorandum over. The stated grounds were freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, and Central Command called the strait a vital international waterway. That phrase is doing work. Calling it an international waterway is a legal position about who it belongs to. A clause about the strait's future administration implies a different position entirely. 6 days later, the blockade came back. Point 4, reversed. And on the same day, Iran declared the agreement finished too. Here is the part I did not expect. Tehran's deputy foreign minister said no obligations under the memorandum remain in force, for either side. But he did not point at point 5. He pointed at point 1. The core of the agreement, he said, was the immediate and permanent cessation of the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, and Israeli operations against Hezbollah had continued. Remember Lebanon. There it is. So the document died twice, 6 days apart, and the two parties killed it over different paragraphs. Washington ended it on the clause about the strait. Tehran ended it on the clause about the war. Which brings us back to point 9, the status quo clause, the most checkable sentence in the whole agreement. No new sanctions, no additional forces. By the middle of July, the blockade was back. The Treasury was issuing fresh designations, and both sides were striking. Whether that breaches point 9 depends entirely on whether the agreement was still in force at the time, and each side says the other one killed it first. I will leave that one open, and I am not sure it can be closed at all, which may be the most honest thing this episode can tell you. By the end of July, the strikes were paused and talks were being described as ongoing. Oil prices fell on the news. The clock in point 3 has not run out. It runs to the 16th of August. Let me go back to where this started. 2 governments, 1 document, 60 days. One of them walked away on the 8th of July over the clause about the strait. The other walked away on the 14th over the clause about the war. Both of them were reading the same 14 points, and both of them were reading them correctly. Here is what I think happened, and this is my reading, not a fact I can hand you. The Islamabad Memorandum was not a bad agreement badly executed. It was a good agreement about everything except the one thing the war was actually about. 13 of its 14 points are specific enough to be checked. Dollar figures, day counts, named institutions, named methods, a status quo clause so plain that either it held or it did not. And then point 5, which carried the actual dispute, was drafted to survive the signing ceremony. That was probably the only way to get a signature in June. I want to be fair about that. 3 weeks of reduced fighting is not nothing, and an agreement that answered the Hormuz question in plain language might never have been signed at all. Somebody made a judgment that the pause was worth the postponement. That judgment may have been right. What I keep coming back to is that the postponement had no mechanism attached, not a shorter deadline, not an arbitrator, not a fallback if the dialogue with Oman produced nothing. The hardest question in the document was the only one handed to a conversation with no date on it. Everything else in that text was drafted by people who clearly knew how to write a deadline. And here is the part worth keeping, because it is not really about this agreement. The next time you read a ceasefire, a framework, an interim deal, any document announced as a breakthrough, go looking for the paragraph where the drafting changes register. Look for where an obligation of result becomes an obligation of effort. Look for where a deadline gets replaced by a dialogue. Look for something described as free, or temporary, or suspended for a fixed period only, because that word is telling you what the parties expect to happen when the period ends. That paragraph is where the real disagreement lives. It is almost never the one quoted in the announcement. It is the one left soft enough that both sides could sign underneath it, and it is the one that will decide when the agreement stops holding. The Islamabad Memorandum did not answer who controls the Strait of Hormuz. It bought 60 days of not answering, and it charged for that time in advance. If you have read an agreement lately where one paragraph was written softer than the rest, tell me which document and which paragraph. I want to know whether this pattern holds outside this war. This episode is built on the text of the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding as archived by the American Presidency Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where it is filed as a draft with blank fields in its opening line. Statements by governments and by parties to the conflict are identified as claims and attributed to the outlet that carried them. The Iranian foreign minister's reading of Article 5 comes from a single interview with the newspaper Iran, republished widely. That is one source, not several. The interpretation of paragraph 5 as favoring Iranian authority over the strait was published by Michael Singh of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy before this episode was written. Information in this episode is current as of the 31st of July, 2026. The 60-day clock in point 3 runs to the 16th of August, and events after that cutoff are outside this analysis. No casualty figures appear here, and none were used to build the argument. This is not official confirmation from any government or institution. Some reports include unverified claims and conflicting accounts. The purpose here is to analyze patterns and implications. Reading a 14-point agreement line by line takes longer than summarizing what people said about it, and the slow version has a smaller audience by design. Membership is what pays for the hours between the document and the script. It costs about what a barrel of the crude in this story costs, once a month.